have some things I would like to say on this bill, and I will get into some questions in a little bit, but I want to preface my remarks with the following, that I have and I continue to support reasonable, responsible, and realistic efforts to promote and to support housing affordability. And I choose those two words, housing affordability, very specifically because there's been a lot of discussion we've been hearing about affordable housing, but technically affordable housing and housing affordability are not the same thing, even though they're interrelated. And some point before midnight tonight, I will get back to the difference between those definitions. I'm speaking as a senator, but also I wear a hat that for the past 16 years, I've been serving in my town as a planning and zoning commissioner. And for the past 15 years, I've been honored to actually be the chair. So when I'm talking about housing affordability, attainable housing, affordable housing, what do we do with land use regulations, all these different things that I'll get into, I actually have real-world experience with it. I've been involved in writing affordable housing plans for my town and trying to promote what I call housing affordability. I don't think there have been too many people in this legislature that I know of who actually have that experience. I know of one, and my apologies if I'm missing anybody in this Capitol, my good friend Representative Doug Dubitsky, who also serves his town well on a planning and a zoning commission. But that real-world experience, just not talking academically about what do we do to help people with regards to housing needs in towns, such as the 13 towns I represent in Northeast Connecticut, many of them small towns, but actually being there in the real world where the rubber meets the road, actually implementing and administering them and adjudicating them and fixing them and making them work over time for people. And I've appreciated that opportunity that I've had for 16 years. And even though I would look forward to more years in that, this is actually going to be my last year serving my town in that capacity. I'm not running for re-election for that position. 16 years has been a long time, and I've enjoyed it. But one of the other things I want to say as well is that there have been, in some testimony that's been brought forward when there's been discussions this session about housing affordability and affordable housing, fair share, whatever you want to call it, there's been a lot of academic reports and academic discussions and maps and data sets and Excel flow sheets, and I didn't bring them with me today. I brought more than enough folders with me today. But despite all of that, I get back to what is the real world impact and what is it we're really trying to do. And I'm going to get into some of that discussion, but I did want to preface my remarks a little bit in that regard. One thing about HB 998 that we are discussing and that I'm speaking to is that we all know, and my colleagues have spoken very well to this. We just heard the good Senator Wong, talk about process. And I'm not going to belabor that point, but I am going to speak to it because I think it's important. That we know that this bill had added much to it, a lot to it. At the last minute, so to speak, that happened in the House. I don't know to what degree there was other input, but there wasn't much time for input, ideas, and actually being inclusive, working with people. And I've heard in some preface remarks when this bill was rolled out about wanting to work inclusively or working with people or a willingness to work, but I don't see that that process happened actually. And it just, to me, I always get concerned in that regard because when I create rules for my town, for planning and zoning, especially when I talk about zoning regulations, I don't want to rush that process. I want to make certain that we're doing things in a very careful and thoughtful manner, and I just don't understand why this process seemed to be rushed, merging a bunch of things together, but I believe others have spoken well on that, and I may get back to that point later sometime before midnight. To me, I'm concerned about a process. It may have been efficient, but efficiency is not the same as effectiveness or productivity. Some people think they are, but it's not. And that just is concerning to me as far as some of the things put into this bill, and specifically about fair share, that I think could have been done better. And there was an opportunity, for example, to improve 830G, but that amendment was shot down on party lines, unfortunately. And I think some of the things put in about fair share, for example, and housing affordability in here, because of the way the process unfolded, that this bill has come to us in the form it's come to us, to me seems to any benefit would be short-term, would actually, and I use the term benefit loosely, and I dare to say that, I think the benefits would be ephemeral. And in fact, if we look at where the word ephemeral comes from, it references in some degree mayflies, which usually don't live more than 24 hours. I think it doesn't really look long-term in my concern to what we really should be doing for housing affordability. I don't think that's a good way to be making public policy. I would have loved to have seen more of a process, but it is what it is, and we're here. I'm just concerned that it amalgamates various things into this bill, and especially about what we're doing with trying to promote housing affordability statewide and what looks to be regional wide, just not specifically for each town, into some sort of asymmetric alloy that I don't think is durable, I don't think is good. And again, specifically, I'm referencing Section 516 in my comments. But speaking of 516, I would like to actually get into that, because I think it's important that we look at the details of it. There's been some discussion of it, but I don't see real specific detail. And this will also, at times through you, Madam President, get into some questions that I have regarding, to the proponent of the bill. But I may have some rhetorical questions, and I'll flag those before I do them. But when I look at Section 516, and I hope that I have the right line numbers written down, I apologize ahead of time if I don't. Just looking through the components, I look at the definitions. That's what things seem to start with. And there's a description of affordable housing unit. I don't have any concern or question about that. I think that's actually straightforward. That's fine. There's some discussion about a definition or talking about commission, zoning commission, zoning authority. And I think what's spelled out there is reasonable. We do know that some towns choose to have a separate planning commission and a separate zoning commission. I think most municipalities do combine them together into a planning and zoning commission. I think that's good. Again, I chair a planning and zoning commission, and I think it's good that we have folks in their town, elected by the people of their town, representing the people of their town, because they're from the town and they understand the town, who can talk about planning and then also write regulations, which is zoning, and then administer and interpret those regulations. Even though technically they're two different things, they're interrelated, and I think that's extremely important, and I value combined planning and zoning commissions, and I'm very glad my town has that, but nothing against towns that choose not to do that. There's also a definition of commissioner, talking about the commissioner of housing. I think that's reasonable. I don't have any real beef with that. We talk about dwelling unit, and I think that's a reasonable definition. There's a number of different definitions out there, and having spent literally months and months some years ago in my town as we redid our zoning regulations, I was very happy to lead that project. We did good work. To define dwelling unit might be easier said than done. It can really get into a lot of nitty-gritty details, and I was pleased that after a number of months we finally agreed on a definition. But I don't have a problem with that definition, dwelling unit, as it is in this section, although it does remind me also that I think it was close to 6 or 8 months that we had to spend in my Planning and Zoning Commission trying to figure out a definition of road, which people might think is easy, but actually it really wasn't how we would describe different types of roads and traffic patterns and things like that. We finally just went with the definition we were using for years and moved forward, and that has been serving us well. But it gets to the point that definitions matter, and what we're really looking at and what we're defining matters, and I'm going to get into that later. But again, when we're talking about these types of issues, how we're actually saying they exist, how we define them, what we're really using for terminology, that has a real impact, just not in a law, but in the real world use, in the real world way that we look at these things. And that's extremely important. But I don't have a problem with the dwelling unit that's listed there. There's median income listed in Section 516. References to state median income determined by the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development. I've looked at those data sets. I don't have any reason to disagree with HUD. I think that's very reasonable to put in. There's also a description about what multifamily housing means. I don't have a problem necessarily with that. In fact, that's a pretty common definition if you really boil down what multifamily housing is. So I think that's very reasonable to have in there. And I'll get back to multifamily housing a little bit later. Again, I'll have to do that sometime before midnight. One definition that I do have a concern about, not so much a question, but I do really have a concern. I'm going to get into that in some more substance of Section 516, is municipal fair share allocation. I think that's gets into what exactly are we talking about. Here in this bill, if people have read it, it means the portion of the minimum need for affordable housing units in a planning region as determined pursuant to subsection B of this section that is allocated to a municipality located within such planning region. And again, I'm going to reserve some comments and questions a little bit later because there's further things described about that, or a quote-unquote methodology about how one determines that. There's also some discussion about planning region. I think I don't have any concerns or issues with that. We do have, I believe, 9 planning regions. I'm proud to represent towns that span 2 planning regions. Some of them are in the capital region COG. Some of them are in the northeastern COG, my own town included. So I don't necessarily have any issue with that. But I will get back to that in a little bit, because when we're talking about planning regions, we need to keep in mind how do we view that when also we're talking about individual and unique, I believe 169 municipalities in this state. And I'm going to get back to that, and probably will reuse that language in a little bit when I get into a few things moving forward. And then one of the last things that's defined as I'm going through line by line of Section 516 that was put into this bill that wasn't there originally. Secretary, meaning the Secretary of OPM. That's fine. I don't have a problem with that definition. I do have a problem later when I get into some discussion about how that's actually used later on in this section. And I'll be getting into that in a little bit. One thing that I would like to do, and I was remiss not saying it when I talked about the COGS, is I do thank and appreciate the work the COGS do. I've spent a lot of time working with COGS, especially Northeastern COG, and they do a lot of good work. They do help with regards to some regional planning, but they also are respectful of the fact that they represent individual towns, and they're not there to usurp what those towns do. They're there to help what the towns do, and I appreciate what the Capital Region COG does in that regard and the Northeastern COG does, and we should be mindful that whatever this legislature decides to do, we also don't usurp that. But the concept of local decision-making is not at all abstract. It is a very real issue and has very real impacts in each of the towns. I think this section that I'm describing, for lack of a better term, loses sight of that. That may have not been the intention. Maybe it was, I don't know. But it loses sight of that. And people, and I say this a lot, I believe I've said this in this chamber previously, I'm happy to say it again, which is the people of Connecticut know best what is best for their towns. And I'm going to say it one more time because it's important that we all remember that. The people of Connecticut know best what is best for their towns. I do not doubt that. I believe that's a truism, and I've yet to hear any cogent or good argument that refutes it. There's an attempt, I believe, through this fair share process to attack that. I'll get into that in a little bit. I think that's folks in academia who may not really fully understand the real-world impacts of making zoning rules. But that's extremely important. And if we can't recognize that unanimously in this legislature, let alone in this circle, then I think state government has a big problem, or bigger than I think it may already have, as I'm going to try to outline articulately as best as I can. But I do trust the people in the towns, and I do certainly trust the people in my town who elected me to represent them to make planning and zoning decisions. And I think the state should very much keep that in mind as well. I'm going to get into asking some questions, if I may, through you, Madam President, of the proponent of the bill. And I'm just going to go through them in the order that they pop up in the text of this bill as it was brought forward to us to debate and ultimately decide if we get to that point today. But when I start looking in, and again, I hope I have the right line numbers, I'm starting to look into lines 740 to 746, and one concern I have is when it talks about the secretary, again, that's Secretary of OPM, quote, in consultation with the Commissioners of Housing and Economic and Community Development, and I'm going to emphasize this, as may be determined by the Secretary. That seems to be given very broad, I think too broad authority to one person, to the Secretary, to start getting into what does one do seeking consultation, as later in this section, certain decisions are going to be made that then seemingly will flow back to us at some point to have to review and decide. And I think that's too much authority. I think that takes it away from this legislature. I think it's very vaguely defined, and I think that that is, lack of a better term, a weakness of that part of this section of the bill, and I don't think it's right, and I think it gets to divorcing and taking away from people, especially their elected representatives, and we are. Every single one of us in this circle represents the entirety of the population of the state of Connecticut. I don't think we should be sending our responsibility to just one person to be making certain decisions about who that person consults with. That seems to be very open-ended, and I think if there had been time to have vetted that through, something better, and I think something good could have been achieved without knocking the Secretary of OPM out of the mix. I have nothing against the Secretary. This is just purely one person in that position, so I'm talking about that in that regard, not about the current person who serves in that. We then get into later, it talks about that some of the people who can be consulted with are, quote, experts, end quote. And through you, Madam President, what actually does the term experts in this bill that's brought to us mean? What is the legislative intent of that word?
Senator Moore.
Through you, Madam President, I would assume experts are people who have experienced, lived, and knowledgeable about the process and the issue. Through you, Madam President.
Thank you. Senator Gordon.
Thank you, Madam President. I appreciate the good senator answering that. I'm going to do a follow-up, again, specifically about the word experts. Is the intent that experts are people who are academic and have no real-world experience?
Senator Moore.
Through you, Madam President, I don't see that exception here. Through you.
Thank you, Senator Gordon.
Thank you, and through you, Madam President, and does the word experts also mean, or has an intent, or also could include people who have practical, real-world experience with regards to this topic, not just somebody who is in academics and likes to write papers?
Senator Moore.
Through you, Madam President, I don't see that definition here. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Gordon.
And through you, Madam President, so could it be interpreted then that if the Secretary of OPM were to want to consult with a quote or a group of experts, end quote, that the Secretary could just decide to use that term as it's in the bill and only consult people who are in academia and don't have real-world experience?
Senator Moore.
Through you, Madam President, I would believe, based on the knowledge of the Secretary, that they would take the most qualified people who have both knowledge and book knowledge and lived experience. Through you.
Thank you, Senator Gordon.
And through you, Madam President, but separate from what one might expect a Secretary of OPM to do, it is possible then, given this term experts, that as Secretary of OPM, whoever that may be at particular time, could choose just to use the term experts as it's in this bill and only then consult with someone who's in academia, not someone with real-world experience?
Senator Moore.
Through you, Madam President, I believe that the OPM Secretary and others involved in this would try to get the people who have the most experience and knowledge of the subject. Many of the people that you mentioned earlier in the debate, they would be going after these same people. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Gordon.
And thank you to the good Senator. I think the way this is written could indeed mean that the Secretary of OPM could just choose to go with someone who's in academia, not have any real-world experience the way it's written. And I think the answers to the question support my interpretation. Moving on, there's the word advocates. And through you, Madam President, to the good Senator, does the term advocates mean, or is the legislative intent that the Secretary of OPM, whoever that person may be at that time, could choose an advocate who only has academic experience and no real-world experience?
Senator Moore.
Through you, Madam President, I would, excuse me, I would believe that that person would try to get the person who has a combination or one or the other. I don't think they would zero in on one quality of that person. That is my opinion. Through you.
Thank you, Senator Gordon.
And thank you. And through you, Madam President, to the good Senator, is the legislative intent of having put in the word advocates that a Secretary of OPM, whoever that person may be at that time, would endeavor to choose people who aren't just academics, but also people who have real-world experience, even if someone in academia has real-world experience?
Senator Moore.
Through you, Madam President, I would think they would do both.
Senator Gordon.
And through you, Madam President, is it possible that the way this is put in, without a real definition of advocates, but looking at the word advocates, that a Secretary of the OPM, whoever that person may be at any given time, if this were to become effective, could choose to interpret that word advocates as broadly or loosely defined and only choose someone from academia and not someone with real-world experience in our towns and municipalities in Connecticut?
Senator Moore.
Through you, Madam President, that's very speculative. I can't respond to that. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Gordon.
Thank you, Madam President. I do appreciate the clarification on the question. It actually does indeed answer my question that indeed the way it is broadly listed without any clear clarification in the wording that indeed a Secretary of the OPM could just choose somebody from academia and not with real-world experience or knowledge of our municipalities in our state of Connecticut, and that's concerning to me. I'll move on, but I may at some point, again, have to do that before midnight, get back to those terms. Moving on to the next term, it talks about, quote, statewide organizations that represent municipalities, end quote. What is the legislative intent of those words? Is that would mean that it would be organizations that would represent cities, suburbs, and also small towns? Is it only looking at one organization, or is the legislative intent to have more than one so that there is a good broad coverage of the different types of towns, categories of towns and cities that we have in this great state? Through you, Madam President.
Thank you, Senator Moore.
Thank you, Madam President. Statewide is statewide, which would cover all of the state. I believe that would cover small towns and large towns. Through you, Madam.
Thank you, Senator Gordon.
And thank you to the good senator. I appreciate that. And I would make certain that if indeed this bill were to come for a vote before midnight tonight, and if it were to pass before midnight tonight, that we make certain it's very clear to a secretary of the OPM who would have to act upon it that we want to make certain that we're representing the mix of the types of municipalities that make up the fabric of this state, and not, say, overlook small towns in favor of bigger towns or vice versa, however it may be. So I want to make certain that's a very important point. And that's something we should hold a secretary of the OPM's feet to the fire to make certain there is proper representation. It gets back to some comments previously made in this debate about inclusivity and a willingness to work and working with people. Moving on, there's also wording in here, quote, organizations with expertise in affordable housing, end quote. And if I may ask a question of the good senator through you, Madam President. Oh, is that?
Senator Moore. Sorry, Senator Gordon. To Senator Moore. Sorry, we're in transition here.
Sorry to interrupt the changing of the guard. What does the term expertise in affordable housing mean as far as the legislative intent of this part of the bill?
Senator Moore.
Through you, Madam President. Good to see you up there. I believe the words speak for themselves, and thank you. Through you, Madam President.
Senator Gordon.
And Madam President, again through you, I apologize if my question wasn't clear. I'll try to clarify my question. When we're talking about, quote, expertise, end quote, in any given field, but in this case in affordable housing, what actually is the legislative intent? It says expertise, but what does that really mean? Expertise in academia, writing papers? Does it mean someone who has expertise in actually, or I should say organizations that are actually out there on the ground working with municipalities and crafting affordable housing plans, such as COGS, perhaps private planning and zoning groups, of which there are some in the state? What exactly does that mean, or is it just a broad definition that would give a lot of deference to the Secretary of the OPM?
Senator Moore.
Through you, Madam President, I think it's a combination of both of those. Thank you.
Senator Gordon.
And thank you, and I appreciate the answer from the good senator. I'm glad I was able to clarify and reword my question to get the answer. Moving on. There's also something in here that refers to, open quotes, I believe this also refers to different types of organizations that have expertise in, and then it talks about fair housing and planning and zoning, end quotes. And through you, Madam President, to the good senator, and I do appreciate her patience in letting me ask these questions so that way I can make certain things are clear in my mind. I think this is good for the public record as well. These would have been things brought up previously if this had previously been able to have an opportunity for things to be brought forward. But when we're talking about organizations relative to fair housing, but also planning and zoning, could that include organizations? Could that include municipalities with regards to people who serve on planning and zoning commissions?
Senator Moore.
Through you, Madam President, I believe it could.
And I appreciate that.
Senator
Sorry.
Gordon.
And I appreciate that because I think that's extremely important that we note that, because I would hate to see organizations that, for planning and zoning, that would exclude those who are actually doing the work, or exclude organizations who include certified planners or people who have their Casio designation or certification and are serving as zoning enforcement officers. I think those are valuable resources. I can tell you from experience, and I have the luxury as chair of my town's planning and zoning, that a day, other than usually holidays and weekends, that doesn't go by that I'm having to interact with certain organizations, experts, including staff hired by my town or contracted by my town. They're very valuable. They're extremely helpful. And when we're getting into, in my town, planning discussions, we do that usually the first Thursday of every month. We meet twice a month, sometimes 3 times a month if my fellow commissioners are up for it. We're all volunteer, so we are mindful of how much time we do take away from home. Really being able to work with these people when we're thinking of planning, and I'm very fond of saying we don't want to put the cart before the horse, which means you're starting to do zoning and coming up with regulations and laws before you've really thought through planning. And that gets to my earlier comment, which is a combined planning and zoning commission is extremely valuable when the same people are planning, the same people are doing the zoning. And I've always enjoyed that. But I think that would be extremely important because it's extremely valuable, and things can go awry if you really don't rely upon those folks. And I want to make certain we are very much including these people in doing what we can to very much include them. With regards to additional, I'm just concerned as I'm moving through this bill that we're getting into when it talks about establishing a methodology for each municipality's fair share allocation, which then starts getting into the meat of the issue. And that's something I think we really need to be thinking about and be extremely careful about when we're talking about fair share allocation. And I do want to go through that. One of the things I'm concerned about is when there's talking about shall establish a methodology, we're talking in here, determine need for affordable housing units in each planning region. I think that gets into some big concerns when we're talking about trying to do that in a region. We need to be very careful what we mean by that, because some regions can encompass different types of towns. For example, if I look at my district and we take a look at, or if I look at actually, let's say the 2 COGs that planning regions I represent, I could go from a town of Vernon, which is the biggest town in my district, to Union, which is, I think, the smallest populated town in Connecticut, 781 people. I like Union. They have an old home day every year in Union, which is phenomenal. And if anyone would like to join me, I'm happy to have you come out. They do phenomenal barbecue by the Union Fire Department, and I enjoy that. But those are, in a same planning region, potentially, 2 very different things. So as far as 2 very different types of towns, very different makeups, and if we're going to start tagging these types of towns that are very different from each other, yet potentially in planning region, then that really gets into how are we trying to allocate fair share, which would be very unfair to allocate. So I think that's very concerning when we're starting to talk about that. The bill then moves on to talk about fairly allocating, quote, end quote. And through you, Madam President, to the good senator, what actually does fairly allocating mean? What is the legislative intent of that? The words are there, especially the word fairly.
Senator Moore.
Through you, Madam President, it's the word fair. Standing here, I think of a lot of reasons, different definitions of it, but I believe what we define in the dictionary is fair. It's a common usage word. Through you.
Senator Gordon.
Madam President, I appreciate the answer by the good senator. I think we need to be very careful, and this is one of the, it's part of the crux of the problem of this having been put into the bill as presented to us, is fairly allocating can have many definitions. And in fact, what we've seen with data that's come out from Fair Share and some things that have come out with some academic reports stating that zoning is unfair, and thus we need to correct it, which I will refute. That is a very broad meaning, and I think it is fraught with biases, and I think those types of biases are inherent when we're talking about fair share and fairly allocating. We need to be very, very careful about that, so we are not unnecessarily, or I think in this regard, potentially purposely tagging municipalities, especially small towns, and then setting them up to fail. I believe there has been efforts to try to blame small towns or many towns that can't meet the outdated provisions of 830G, and say, well, they're just not, doing what's right. And to me, that, doesn't make any sense. I think that gets into a post hoc, ergo propter hoc type of argument fallacy, which is after this, therefore because of it, and trying to connect the dots there when there really isn't a direct cause and effect. I think that we have to be very, very careful, and I'm very concerned about that. And it's one of the reasons I will not support this bill as presented. Moving forward, one of the things that I do want to cite, this also talks about considering the duty of the state and municipalities to affirmably further fair housing pursuant to Section 8-2, which I have read through, of the general statutes, and it talks about the United States Code, 42 U.S.C. 3608. I think we have to be careful what exactly the parts of those two, the state statute and the U.S. Code, actually we're citing. And if I may ask through you, Madam President, of the good senator, is what's in this bill before us referring to Connecticut General Statute 8-2, when it talks about affirmatively furthering fair housing and talking about considering that there's a duty of the state and the towns, is it referring to any one part of 8-2, because 8-2 is long, or is it just referring to the entirety of 8-2?
Senator Moore.
Through you, Madam President, it only says 8-2. It doesn't define anymore. It could be all of it. Thank you. Through you, Madam President.
Senator Gordon.
Thank you, and if I may do a follow-up question through you, Madam President, of the good senator. So there's no one particular part that was flagged in 8-2. It's just all of 8-2.
Senator Moore.
Through you, Madam President, it says in accordance with Section 8-2, according to the bill. Thank you.
Senator Gordon.
Thank you. I appreciate that, because when it talks about pursuant to the section, I just wanted to make certain this was referring to the entirety of it, of which some of the 8-2 doesn't have anything to do with fair housing. Some parts do, if there was any particular part. So I appreciate that. A question through you, Madam President, to the good senator. When we're talking about the duty of state and municipalities pursuant to this 42 U.S.C. 3608, is that referring to the entirety of that portion of the United States Code, or is there a particular part that was flagged and thus the legislative intent in referring to it?
Senator Moore.
Through you, Madam President, according to the information here, it's 42 U.S.C. 3608. It doesn't mention anything other than that.
Thank you. Senator Gordon.
And thank you. That part of the United States Code is a little bit lengthy, but nevertheless, I appreciate the answer to that. If it's potentially encompass it, it's all that is very helpful to know. A few other things when we're getting into the methodology, and I think this is extremely important because there's been a lot of discussion about methodology, and I think we've seen all the different things that have been coming out about what is felt to be the overall need for affordable housing in this state, the different regions, each town that might get a certain allocation. There's been a lot of methodology put into that, and when this bill is talking about that the Secretary of OPM shall ensure that the fair share allocation methodology, and it goes on to include a number of things, which really gets into part of the crux of this part of the bill. When it talks about its design with due consideration for the duty of the state and each municipality, and that's why I was asking questions about Connecticut General Statute 8-2 and 42 U.S.C. 3608, when it's talking about due consideration, and those words are specifically in there, if I may ask through you, Madam President, to the good senator, what does due consideration mean? What is the legislative intent of those two words together in that order?
Senator Moore.
Could we stand at ease for a moment, please,
We
Madam
can stand at ease, Senator. Senator Moore.
Madam President, could I ask the good gentleman to point out where it is in the legislation?
Senator Gordon.
And Madam President, to the good senator, I apologize. I wasn't citing line numbers, so I apologize. I think if my copy is correct, I believe it's line 758, if I have the right copy of the text, the way it's printed.
Senator Moore.
Through you, Madam President.
Yes, Senator Moore.
Thank you. It's designed, just as it says here, to give due consideration, which means obligated to, for the duty of the state, each municipality, to affirmatively further fair housing in accordance with Section 8-2 of the general statutes.
Thank you, Senator Gordon.
And I appreciate the answer by the good senator. I'm just concerned if due consideration isn't further defined, what exactly does that mean? And I think we need to be careful, especially when words are being used in a methodology that's going to come back to us, it would seem, with some sort of imprint upon it or authority upon it. We need to better understand, and I think if this had gone through better vetting, I think that could have been fleshed out some more. It got back to what I was talking about, that definitions matter, words matter. They're not abstract. So I think that is another concern about the methodology that is being proposed to being looked at. I'm also concerned that the methodology, when we're talking about due consideration, I think that may already be a fait accompli. I think there's already a plan in place about which methodology to use. We've already seen that methodology in prior wording. There's already been references, not in this bill, but otherwise, that have come out by advocates for what that methodology might refer to. So that's why I'm asking about this, because we need to better understand this methodology. I just don't see it fully spelled out here, despite all the wording about it. And I want to raise that concern because it's a real concern about what's going to go into creating a product and what is that product that's going to come back out to us. So again, I'm very concerned about about that, and that's why I flagged it, and that's why I appreciate the good senator answering my question in that regard. And so that way I think not only me can better understand it, but I think all of us in the public can try to better understand it, as well, especially if they're seeing it for the first time, given the way it came out of the House, to us. But I'll move on. But again, I may get back to it in some of my other comments. Moving on down, if I have the numbering correct in my version, I apologize. If I don't, I'm looking at lines 761 to 765. And it talks about here that the methodology is going to relies on, quote, appropriate metrics, end quote. And then it gets on to then, quote, of the minimum need for affordable housing units in a planning region to ensure adequate housing options. And I'm going to stop there, and I'll end the quotes there, even though there'll be an ellipsis because there's further words beyond that. If I may, through you, Madam President, to the good senator, dare to ask another question. What does the words appropriate factors mean? What is the legislative intent of those words?
Senator Moore.
Through you, Madam President, that would, the appropriate metrics would be the information that is gathered from the people who are working on this to make sure they have all the information. Through you, Madam President.
Thank you, Senator Gordon.
And I appreciate that answer. If I may do a follow-up through you, Madam President, to the good senator. So could somebody such as me interpret appropriate metrics, meaning whoever's going to be involved in trying to sort this out? Appropriate could mean understanding the reality of each one of the 169 municipalities in our state, and they would actually have to go to every single one to understand in order to come up with, quote, appropriate metrics, end quote?
Senator Moore.
Through you, Madam President, I would say that the people who are looking at this have the expertise, may consider 169 towns, may have different organizations like the COG and other people who represent those presenting that information. Through you, Madam President.
Thank you, Senator Gordon.
And I appreciate the good senator's answer, and that does help clarify. It gets back to one of the points that I mentioned earlier, and I'm going to say it again, but it's a segue into an additional part of this discussion that I think has been overlooked in this legislation, not by the people who have already been speaking to it. What I'm going to get back to is what I've already said in this, and I may say it a number of times through my discussion. Again, I'll have to make certain I wrap up before midnight, but nevertheless, I'll say it again right now. The people of Connecticut know best what is best for their towns. And I'm going to repeat that again. The people of Connecticut know best what is best for their towns. And if we're going to be looking into this methodology, we're going to be looking into appropriate metrics, especially minimum need for affordable housing units in a planning region, and each planning region includes a certain number of towns. We want to make certain that whoever is going to be coming up with this methodology understands each one of the 169 towns and cities that make up this great state of Connecticut. And why do I say that? Because when we talk about if there's going to be this plan that's going to come out, each of the towns and cities in some way are going to have to deal with it. That gets into what happens with land use regulations and who creates land use regulations. I can tell you that because I know that with 16 years of experience. It's planning and zoning commissions. It's a planning commission that works then with a separate zoning commission, depending upon what the town is set up. But it also then gets into dovetailing with an inland wetlands and watercourse agency. They have separate statutory authority. But I can tell you in my work as a planning and zoning commission, we dovetail and work with them. And also conservation commissions, zoning boards of appeals. There's a lot that goes into it. It gets to a point that when you're thinking of planning Planning can be abstract initially, but then you really want to drill down and make certain you understand. And I would really hope, and I would have hoped that this would have been very clear in this bill, but it isn't. Although I do appreciate the prior answer from the good senator to the question I did ask, that whoever is working on this, and also I would encourage the secretary of the OPM, whoever that may be at that time, to actually get out and hoof it to each town. If these people were to come out to my 13 towns, happy to do it. I even previously had offered to some of these advocates, not in this year, but prior years, if they wanted to come out to my town, because some of the information that was being said about lack of affordable housing in my town was actually not correct. And that just gets into when you're looking at things abstract, you're looking at things in academia, and you're not looking at it in the real world, there's a big disconnect, and you have decisions that are not local decision making, and they are divorced from the reality that the people in each town live. And we need to be extremely mindful of that, and I don't think the wording in this bill, in this section, is mindful of it. I'm not saying that's purposeful, although I do have some concerns about some inherent bias in the way this is being promoted, not by the good senator, but by others. So we need to be very, very careful. And I'm mindful of that when I make decisions in my town reviewing housing applications, such as subdivisions, reviewing business applications, at times we actually go out into the field. I actually wrote an article years and years ago, probably I think it was like 16 years ago, that if you do things with decision making without understanding the reality, then you don't make good decisions, and you then have unintended consequences, and we're talking about how that can affect people in their towns. Those unintended consequences are very bad, and we should endeavor to redouble and triple our efforts to try to minimize that from happening, understanding nothing's perfect. With that said, I'm mindful that I've done site walks where I get a map of a plot of land, say 100 acres that someone wants to develop. It looks neat. They give us reports, all sorts of stuff. They give us a presentation, but then we have to actually go out into the field. We actually see what's going on, and you can learn so much that way that you're never going to see on paper. And that gets to my point that I would hope that if this, well, I'm not hoping it passes, but if it were to pass, provided we get to it before midnight, and if it were to be implemented, then the secretary of the OPM and whoever's involved in this methodology would actually go out into the field. They're going to get so much information other than just what you're going to get in reports and maps, and you fly a drone or you look at a Google map or whatever you do. And I can tell you there have been times that I've gone out into fields and I've had to wear my farmer's work boots that go up above my knees, and we're trudging through mud or wetlands or whatever to really understand what are the characteristics. What is the characteristics of that land? What are the characteristics of the town? What is the character of that area in different parts of each town and city? As we well know, in our own towns that we represent, are different. One town isn't homogeneous all throughout. It's its own little fabric of different things and neighborhoods and communities and things like that. So we have to be mindful of that. And again, I think that this effort with, quote, fair share, end quote, misses that point. Again, I'm not saying that that's purposeful, although I do have my concerns, but I'm not going to go down that road right now. We really should have, not we, but this should have been buttoned up more in that regard to really put a lot more specifics. And again, it gets back to the process that my good friend Senator Long had mentioned about how this rolled out from the House to us at this timing on this last day now of a Senate session when we have, I forget how many more hours left to go. So I think that gets to a process, but it gets to, again, there should be a better process when we're talking about making these types of decisions and understanding what we're doing with regards to this type of methodology. When I go through some further parts of this wording, there's some of the similar wording about appropriate factors. I'm not going to go through that more, or fairly allocating. I'm not going to go through that more, because I appreciate that there's the same wording that's throughout some of this section with that, and I appreciate the Good Center having answered my questions when I asked them about that, so I won't duplicate those questions, at least at this point in time I won't. I'm not going to go through the rest. I don't have any other questions right now of the Good Center. I appreciate her patience. In dealing with my many questions, I like to ask questions so I can understand things myself. I never like to assume things, although I think the wording of this bill makes assumptions, and I think it makes wrong assumptions, and it's going to come out with a wrong product that isn't good for the people of Connecticut. That's my feeling. I think reading through this and knowing what's led up to this with regards to other wording that had been proposed out, I think, supports my concern. This does get into other ways of having to talk about towns that don't have to be assigned a fair share. I think when you start getting into that, picking winners and losers, again, getting into metrics like that is extremely concerning. And again, I think that's a deficiency in the wording that's come out, and I think that's to me, a very, very big concern when we're talking about this bill. But I'm going to move on from going line by line in the bill at this point, but I may, since I seem to be excited about this topic and still have a lot of energy, maybe because of all the donuts I've been eating today, which are full of sugar, which I do indeed love. May get back to it at some point tonight. Again, I'd have to do that before midnight for obvious reasons, but I'll continue on. And I'm just taking a look at my notes to make certain I haven't missed anything, but I don't think I have right now. One thing I do want to follow up on is this issue of setting up a methodology with people that may not fully represent the broad spectrum of Connecticut. And we've heard on other bills this session in some very passionate discussion. And I listen to debate and discussion before I make my own decisions, especially before I vote, because sometimes I learn things that I didn't know, or sometimes it supports my thinking, or sometimes it's actually changed my thinking. Especially if someone raises a very clear, cogent, and common sense argument or statement or answer to a question. I think we need to be very careful about, number one, the broad scope that one's going to give the secretary of the OPM, whoever that person may be at any given time, in setting up this working group. It's way too broad, gives way too much authority. This legislature should not cede that to one person. That doesn't make any sense to me. We're also talking about that, is this really then an unbiased group when we're talking about this type of methodology? I don't think the system that's going to be set up is unbiased. I think there's a lot of evidence to show that it's already a fait accompli, as I've mentioned before, and this is just a way to come up with I don't want to call it a study because it's really not a study, really looking at coming up with a group that this process already, I believe, knows what the end result is that is wanted, and is just trying to set this up, I think, to kind of make it look nice, put some window dressing on it, and come back with something that otherwise was taken out. I think we're going to get the exact same stuff that we've seen in previous wording on fair share. And I'm not a betting man, so I'm not going to take a bet, but I think that's what we're going to see. And I'm very concerned about that, because that's not a good use of resources. That's not good for the people of Connecticut. That's not good for public policy. And I can tell you, when I wear my planning and zoning commissioner hat, which I officially don't have one, but I'll imagine I do, that's never a good way to make decisions about land use in a town. So we need to be extremely careful about that. But I'll move on to some other things. One of the things I do want to stress is there's been this argument, and I've seen some of the news releases and statements from groups and whatever, that having taken out some of the fair share provisions in the House is a loss for the people, and that those who are advocating for a different process aren't really there to help the people of Connecticut, aren't advocating for affordable housing, aren't advocating for making the state better. And I want to say, as someone who has spent years dealing with use of land, encouraging people to do what they legally can do with land they own and pay taxes, sometimes a lot of taxes on, to live, to work, to raise a family, to grow a business and create jobs in a local economy, that these types of political or partisan statements or sound bites that come out in the news, that type of stuff is absolutely wrong. Those of us who have been advocating for years, and especially right now, and I'm not the only one advocating, there's a lot of people, and I appreciate that effort. We do agree with the shared goal that I think every single one of us in this circle agree and share, which is the goal of moving Connecticut forward and trying to help people responsibly and reasonably, understanding that we live in the real world. There are things that we can do, but there's things we may want to do that we just can't achieve. And we have to be mindful of that. But I think we all share that goal, including trying to deal with housing affordability, which I'm going to pivot to soon about those definitions. We share that goal. And I'm proud to share that goal with everybody. And I don't doubt that people who may think differently from me share that goal. And if somebody were to argue to me, well, so-and-so is for this bill and you're against this bill, they clearly don't share your goal. That is absolutely not true. And I will continue to defend that we all share the same goal. But as we all know, you can have a shared goal, and you can ask 36 senators, and we may come up with 36,000 different ways of trying to achieve that goal, or more than 36,000. And that's where I have concerns in this bill. Is it really going to try to achieve moving things forward for Connecticut? I don't think it does. And I've been hopefully making good arguments and good positions about why I think that way. And I'll get to some of that in a little bit more. Also, is the process the right process? I don't think it is. And I've made, hopefully, articulate comments and statements and arguments about it. I think this process is flawed. I think it should get back to what some comments I heard when this bill was rolled out about, and I tried to take notes, about wanting to be intentional in the work that we do, being willing to work together, tag teaming. There's a lot of statements made, and gets back to being inclusive, working overall, trying to have a broad base, making certain that different stakeholders, even if they disagree with each other, are at the table having discussions. I don't see that this bill does that. I think it's a missed opportunity. I think if there had been a better process in this bill coming to us, and again, I'm not blaming the good senator at all. I appreciate the work that she's been doing chairing the Housing Committee. I don't serve on the Housing Committee, but I almost wish I did, so I could have spent time working with her. I think just in general, the way this went through the legislative process, and then getting back to my comment that this became an amalgamation of various things that, as I use the term, an asymmetric alloy, which those types of alloys don't tend to be durable, they don't tend to be substantive, and they fall apart, and then you have to spend time doing something different with a different recipe. I think this is a serious problem, and I think that's going to delay getting to what I think is the goal of what can we do to help people in the state of Connecticut. I am an advocate. I have been for years, and I will continue to be. I am an advocate for addressing the need for affordable housing, housing affordability, attainable housing, in our state. We know that our state has become more and more unaffordable, and the sky-high inflation that occurred for various reasons in this country exacerbated it. The pandemic also didn't help, unfortunately. And we need to recognize that when we talk about unaffordability of housing, that is not because of zoning regulations. That is being made to be the boogeyman, or I'll be politically correct, the boogie person. That is not true. I have yet to see any answer to any question that I have asked over the years of people. When I asked point blank, show me specifically where land use zoning has created this unaffordability situation, I have yet to see a cogent, clear, and common sense answer. In fact, sometimes the answer I get is just this general statement, which to me proves that some people saying this stuff don't really know what they're talking about and just are coming up with these general things and want to push a certain agenda, and they're trying to create a problem, thus there has to be a solution. That's no way to do public policy. To me, that's not common sense, that's nonsense. We should recognize these concerns, and we should endeavor not to pass this bill because of this provision that's in there, if it remains in this bill, and work to take the time, truly be inclusive, truly do a good legislative process, really hear from all the stakeholders, even if we may not like what they have to say. I am willing to hear from them, to include them at the table, and then craft a bill or something regarding this that is truly better, will have a more meaningful impact, and we would collectively as a legislature deserve credit for doing something that helps move Connecticut forward. We should take that opportunity. This wording in this section doesn't take that opportunity. It is a big missed opportunity. That is a shame. I think we can do better, and we should do better, but needless to say, this is the wording before us. We should also recognize that when we're talking about an issue of affordable housing, and I recognize that is an issue, it is a true issue, and anybody who says that that doesn't exist and isn't a concern in Connecticut, I will argue against them. Again, it gets back to our goal of trying to make Connecticut better for people, reasonably and responsibly and realistically. But when we talk about affordable housing doesn't exist in a vacuum. And again, it does not have anything to do with land use zoning regulations, and I'll get into that in a little bit. There's a lot of factors that go into affordability. Some of them government has no control over. Do we really have control over some of the price of land? Do we really have control over the price of all the materials that go into building a house? Which some of them have skyrocketed. If you've at a time had to buy lumber or roofing sheeting material or drywall, if you could find them during a supply shortage, those prices spiked dramatically. Do you think then that people who build houses, whether it's affordable housing, quote unquote, or not, are going to absorb that cost? They can't. It gets passed on. So those have been issues, but it also gets into overall some of the unaffordability of this state. And there's a number of factors. Some of it has been public policy, things that legislature has done or actually choosing not to do. And that factors into a lot. But to distill it down and say that, well, I hear some advocates saying this, well, it's what each town does with its zoning. Again, that makes no sense. I have not seen evidence, and that gets back to what I mentioned earlier, that just because one thing happens before another, there may be a temporal relationship, doesn't automatically mean there's a direct cause and effect. And that's actually a recognized fallacy in an argument. That gets back to the Latin statement that I mentioned, post hoc ergo propter hoc. I took 5 years of Latin, so I like to say Latin terms, but meaning just because something happened after another, therefore it's because of it? No, it isn't. One of the other things that I think is extremely important, and I'm going to want to harp on this, is, and I thank my colleagues, Senator Fazio, Senator Wong, for highlighting this, is 830G isn't just old based upon how long it's been in play, but it is old using a different definition, that it does not work. It does not work because it is outdated. It does not work because it is not matching reality of what is truly should be considered affordable. And there was a great opportunity here earlier to make a meaningful change in what I thought was a great amendment that was brought out, and I was happy to say I supported it and vote for it, to do a good effort to try to improve 830G, and that was shot down on party line votes. That's a missed opportunity. That's a shame, and that shouldn't have happened, but it did. 830G was well-intentioned, has a great goal. It does not work. And why doesn't it work, and why are few towns in this state or cities able to meet the threshold that 830G sets? And it misses the point because it gets into how do we define things. And one of the things I'm mindful of is we're using the term affordable housing. But if you really look at affordable housing and you look at 830G, that's defined by very strict criteria. Very few small towns, including the small towns I represent, can meet that mark. And why is that? Because those strict types of criteria and wanting a developer who's going to come in and build affordable housing, and I've talked with a number of developers who have come to my town of Woodstock to see, could they build affordable housing? And we don't stand in that way. We actually have provisions in our zoning regulations that would welcome that. They have to meet certain building codes, certain public health codes, fire safety codes. We would hope they would. In fact, I've taken efforts over the years as a leader in my town to streamline permitting processes, make it less burden, including for someone who might want to do affordable housing, to decrease the cost of permitting. And I'm proud that we did that to make it more helpful for people to go through this type of permitting process. So we are welcoming. But why do very few towns meet the mark? It's not because they've created zoning regulations to try to prevent affordable housing. It's not because they're creating zoning regulations to try to cherry pick what type of people will move in. It's because when you're talking about a lot of towns that may have no public sewer, no public water, really no public transportation, no Main Street, really not much in the way of large number of jobs. Some of my towns, unless you would like to work on a farm, which gets into different types of housing as far as workforce type housing, and the feds have some rules on that as well. Why would a developer come in without any of that infrastructure, with some of these outside of state roads, municipal roads, wouldn't be able to handle large number of units or however it might be set up? There's no way a lot of the towns can meet that mark. And it's not because they don't want to. It's because there is no ability to meet some of the strict criteria this state put into place and has failed to update, just not over years, but a number of decades. And that gets back to a missed opportunity here today to at least make an effort to see what we can do for 830G. And when you look at some of the things, not just 830G, but let's say fair share, and I'll pick on New Jersey because they're, I think, a poster child relative to this. It's made out that, oh, look, some of this stuff's been done in New Jersey previously, and it's all hunky-dory, it's great, it's idyllic, it's wonderful, it's a Garden of Eden. That's not true. There's been a huge number of court cases in New Jersey over these issues, and there still are. It's become somewhat of a mess. Some communities have been able to work through it, but it's actually a problem. And for some people to say, well, New Jersey's doing it, we should do it, I look to say, well, New Jersey's doing it, why should we do it if it's created problems for them? We should learn from that and not create those problems, which are avoidable problems. And we should learn from the mistakes of other states. And this bill with this section forgets about that. But there are things that other states are doing that we can learn from if we had much better wording and a much better intent of this methodology. and it wasn't a fait accompli with a predetermined outcome that we're now trying to do some type of work on. In addition to affordable housing, there's really the true concept, and I touched upon this in my opening remarks, of housing affordability. Or sometimes I like using the term attainable housing, or there's affordable housing with a capital A, which is the state definition, and affordable housing with a little a, which is what we face in our towns and cities in the real world. And when I'm talking about this section, it doesn't do justice to that. It doesn't really look at that. Again, I talked about housing affordability. In the real world, that's what we really should be doing. It's one thing to have a certain number of quote-unquote affordable housing units, homes, people can live to meet the state criteria for 830G. But because 830G has failed, why? We should look at what's happening in the real world. There are efforts that one can encompass that really actually do help people, and that towns actually are doing. And it gets to the point that we would want whoever in this bureaucracy of this group would actually hoof it out to every single town and hopefully attend planning and zoning commission meetings and understand the work that's already being done that towns and cities, especially small towns, are not getting credit for. And that in and of itself is unfair, and I think an injustice to the good work that people in the towns are doing, because the people of Connecticut know best what's best for their towns, because they live in it, and the people who represent them on planning and zoning commissions are from their town and are working with people in their town. And I can tell you as a planning and zoning commissioner, when I go to my town's transfer station, the running joke over 16 years with my wife has been, oh, I'm just going to quickly go. It's a couple miles down the road. I'll drop my stuff off. I'll be home in like half an hour, and I'm like home half a day later. And I've missed lunch or I've missed dinner. Why? Because I'm an elected town official, and people know it. And they know I'm accessible, and I want to hear from them, so I can make better decisions for them when it comes to land use. And I'm concerned that in this section, the way it's worded, that type of thinking, that type of mentality, that type of process isn't in there. It's another way that state government is divorcing itself from people, and it's not really a government of the people or for the people or by the people. And to me, that's a shame, and we should not allow that to happen. But when we talk about housing affordability, that's what we really should be going after. We should really be reworking 830G and really match it to the reality. We should be thinking creatively. There's a lot of different things that we can do in that regard, and some of them were already mentioned, and I won't go through the long list, because I do hope that I can finish my remarks sometime before midnight tonight. There's some discussions about housing vouchers. When we talk about affordable housing, that doesn't really take that into account, yet that is happening. And that actually can help people with housing affordability. And we should be creative with that and flexible with that, and making certain that the money that this state is spending on that, and I'm not saying it's bad, but we should make certain that it's being used more effectively to help more people in this state who need the help. And I think there's ways to repurpose that, refurbish that, allocate that, realign that, rethink that. Again, a missed opportunity, and I think this legislature should really look at itself and figure out why that's a missed opportunity. There's been also discussions here about not trying to tag different regions or different towns with a one-size-fits-all approach about definition of median income, because what may be median income, let's say, in one part of the state versus another part of the state is very different. And it also has to be put into a clinical context of what does that actually mean for the cost of living in those different parts of the state, just not what median income means. And I think a one-size-fits-all approach from the state top down to every town, or in a region top down to every town, is going to fail. And why is that? And in prior testimony that I've given to the Housing Committee, in prior years also, a one-size-fits-all approach does not tend to work. A top-down approach does not tend to work. I think we've all, as kids, I know I've done it, sometimes done it as an adult, unfortunately, tried to pound a square peg into a round hole and really hope and pray that the more you pound it, the more it's going to fit, and it just doesn't work that way. It ends up being very frustrating. Why are we doing that to our towns and cities instead of partnering with them and working with them? And again, I don't see in this section of the bill, talking about fair share, that it does that at all. Again, another missed opportunity. Why? I don't know why. I don't want to say any ill intent on the purpose of that wording, but again, I'm just concerned that this gets back to what I hear from many people. They're concerned that this is already a preordained outcome of what's going to come back to us if we were to get to a vote tonight before midnight on this, and what we would then see. I don't think we're going to see anything good given what I'm concerned about, the deficiencies and problems in the methodology. And if anyone wants to question that, despite listening to me for a while and continuing to listen to me for a while, show me exactly where in this bill with the various things I've tried to pull out that I'm misinterpreting it, or the answers I've been able to get unto my questions say anything different. So, and I may get back to some more questions. I don't know yet, no. We've also heard discussions about not taking away zoning from towns. There's been an effort by the legislature to take away some local decision-making. Why? That's wrong. Do legislators really think that they know more about each town and the people in those towns than the people in their own towns? I don't think so. And in fact, I don't assume that as a state senator, that I, living in Woodstock, know better than the people in Coventry or the people in Vernon or the people in Hampton or the people in Stafford, than those people in those towns know. That's why I get out. And I'm proud to get out to the 13 towns in my district as much as I can. Talk with people, learn from them, discuss things with them, try to collaborate and be inclusive, and all the different things we've heard in the rollout of this bill. I don't see the legislature doing that in the wording of this bill. And again, that's a big, big concern. We also should make certain that we can encourage and recognize the work that towns are doing in creating what we've heard about incentive zones, growth zones. There's many different ways of doing that. I've been involved in actually creating new zoning districts in my town. You know, I needed to do that to protect 3 lake districts, beautiful lakes. And I came up with wording. And how did I do that? I just didn't do it because I said I wanted to come up with wording. It needed to be done. I did it by actually going out to those communities in my town and meeting with these people, meeting with some of the tax districts of those lakes. What do they want? What don't they want? And crafting wording, having them participate in public hearing processes, working with us at meetings. And we crafted something years ago, and in fact, it's still working and very good today because we invested the time. We really meant when we say we wanted to be inclusive. We really meant when we said we wanted to work with people. We wanted to hear from people. We wanted to make certain we came up with a good work product that just wasn't of good quality at the moment we created it, but was durable and meaningful and didn't require every year having to do a fix, because we really paid attention and we really came up with a good methodology and process of how to do it. That's one of the things I'm not most proud, but it's one of the top things I'm proud of in my 16 years as a town official. Not what was done, but how it was done. And it's one thing to say what's trying to be done with this bill. And again, I think we can agree on the goals of doing what we can do responsibly, but also reasonably and realistically to help people with housing affordability. But it's also how you do it that matters. So it's just not what you do, but also how you do it that matters. And in fact, when I've run for certain years in town government, I've actually used that slogan because I'm known for that. But I don't see that in this section of the bill, and that's a serious problem. And that should be a reason not to want to have that in this bill. If the how it's going to be done isn't good, then we should not rely upon it. We should rethink it and make certain we have a better how. But again, the wording is the wording that's in this bill, and there's only so much one can do about it. Another thing I want to mention is, even though I'm talking about the individuality of each of the 169 towns and cities in our great state, and again, I'm very proud to represent 13 wonderful towns in Northeast Connecticut. Municipalities don't exist in a vacuum. We all know that. Even though they have their individual identities and individual municipal governments, they do partner. They don't need the state to tell them to do that. They do it out of necessity and because they know that can work. But there are some things they just have to do on their own. They don't exist in a vacuum, and we're talking about regional planning. You don't always need some type of bureaucracy to do regional planning. I can tell you over my years of doing planning and zoning that there are many times I don't need a bureaucracy to tell me that I should be talking with some surrounding towns. My town actually is on the border of Massachusetts. I have Southbridge, Massachusetts, right to my north. I live maybe 2 or 3 miles from Southbridge. And if anyone wants to travel up Route 169, it's a designated scenic byway, and it goes right into Southbridge, Massachusetts. It's very beautiful, especially the part that goes through Woodstock. But again, I'm biased in that regard. We actually will hop the border. I've had discussions with municipal agencies across the border because we recognize we're part of a region. We don't need to say, oh, we have a designated region, a planning region, and have a bureaucracy tell us about this stuff. But again, in this bill, on this section I'm talking about, it does not give credit at all in the methodology. I see it nowhere. And I welcome someone correcting me if I am wrong, but I don't think I am. I've read it a number of times since it came out to us somewhat last minute, that it recognizes that. It really doesn't. So we need to recognize that and make certain we're giving credit where credit is due about towns working together. And that includes not necessarily creating a regional planning, but doing it somewhat by default at times. Learning what works in different towns and what doesn't, but not copycatting from one town to another, but saying, this seems to work, maybe it can work in my town. Or maybe we should avoid what's not working in another town and be thankful we didn't fall down, into that pit of quicksand. So we do need to be mindful of that, and we do also, when we're talking about what might happen in a region, we do have a couple of towns that actually abut 2 states. Thompson, Connecticut abuts Rhode Island and Massachusetts. One has to be mindful of those states when Thompson does certain things. And I think, if I'm correct, is it Salisbury that abuts New York and Massachusetts? But they just don't say, oh, the Connecticut border stops here. We're not going to look to see what happens in our region for the towns right over the border. Of course they don't. But again, in this type of methodology and trying to tag stuff to the towns, it gives no credit to that work the towns have been doing long before the state became wise and said, oh, we should be mandating that more. Again, it doesn't give credit to the work that towns are doing. It assumes that towns are doing bad stuff, which again, if they have been doing that over the years, we have had state laws for decades to go after them. Anti-discrimination laws, which I support. Other laws that unfair housing practices. We have those laws, and I'm glad we do. And actually, there's also federal laws in those regards, and I'm glad we have those as well. So if there's been any bad actors over the years, it should have been picked up by now. So at this point in time, to say that towns are bad actors just because they're not meeting certain affordable housing criteria, again, is a political argument. It makes for good sound bites, but it's not actually true. And again, this bill, when I look at this section, makes those types of assumptions. And in fact, some of the advocates for this, if you read the press releases and the things that have come out, outright say that. We should not be letting them get away with that because it is wrong. It is an injustice to the good work that people do in their towns. And this bill does not recognize that, and I think that is a shame. It had been mentioned, I forget which one of my colleagues who spoke probably better than I'm speaking before me, mentioned that there are a couple of municipalities in this state that have no zoning. Eastford is one of them. I represent the very good people of Eastford, and if anybody any year wants to join me in coming out to see Scramble the Duck instead of watching the Puxatawny Phil on Groundhog Day, join me because it happens there. And I was very pleased earlier this year, it was cold, to have my good friend Representative Boyd, who is my representative, join me there. But the people of Eastford have decided over the years they didn't want certain zoning. Doesn't mean they have zero things. But yet, if we're saying that zoning is bad the way the towns are doing it, and therefore they are preventing affordable housing, then how do you explain the real-world finding that in Eastford, they don't have some of the zoning that the surrounding towns do, yet they still can't meet the mark of 830G with, quote, affordable housing, end quote, that the state has mandated years ago. It can't be because they don't have zoning, because isn't zoning bad? But if they don't have zoning, they still can't. It's because, get back to the fact they don't have the infrastructure, they don't have the jobs, they don't have the public transportation to be able to meet that. And this bill, in this section, disregards that, ignores it outright. And that's a shame, and that, I think, gets back to the point that we don't want to be blaming the towns. We want to make certain that they can do as best as they can towards housing affordability. And with this type of methodology that's so loosey-goosey, the way it's listed, really you can't make heads or tails of it. The way it's written in this bill, and again, I'm not singling any person out, I'm just saying, what is this bill that's come to us the way it's come to us? It will not achieve the stated goals, which again I think we all share. A missed opportunity. And that's a shame, and we should be doing better. One of the things I'm mindful of when we talk about local decision making and what the state does in certain things that, like in this section of this bill, which I'm talking to, I have in my home, and I also have in my office, a nice picture of the 4 parts of Norman Rockwell's 4 Freedoms. Beautiful pictures. But it also represents very nicely some very key things, and I won't go through FDR's speech unless people want me to. But there's one of those pictures is of a man, working man, standing up, what looks to be a town meeting, people in the background, saying his piece on whatever is before that town meeting. And in fact, in my town, where we hold our commission meetings, we did have that picture up. And I've cited it many times during some of my meetings. It gets back to the fact that we will want to give opportunities for people to be heard. I don't care who they are. I may disagree with them, but I want to give them that opportunity. In this bill, with this methodology in that section relative to fair share, so to speak, it does not give those opportunities. And it misses the point that local decision making is good. And why is that? And people can recite it if you already know the answer along with me, but I think you know what I'm going to say, is the people of Connecticut know best what is best for their towns. And we should always be mindful of that, especially as elected officials. I've never lost sight of that in my town. With that said, a few other things that I wanted to get into relative to this bill. And I did talk about it earlier, is that each town is unique. I don't see that this methodology, the way it's been presented before, and I know some of the stuff was taken out, and in the wording we're seeing now, recognizes that. It just says, and some of the data sets that have come out before clearly show that you're just going to get assigned a certain fair share, and we're not really going to take into account a lot of different aspects of your town. That misses a whole bunch of stuff and is unfair to the people of those towns. And again, I want to highlight that because that is a big missed, not just missed opportunity, but I think it really goes way off mark and is going to create a bad work product that's in coming up with this methodology, and we should not be allowing that to happen. And one of the things I do want to mention, and this was talked about previously when there's been some talk about fair share, There's an article that came out in the Fordham Law Review in 2021. If anyone wants to read it, I've read it. Volume 90, Issue 3. And it says, over-participation, designing effective land use public processes. And it actually gets into that we have too much public participation in land use decisions. To me, that's wrong. I actually advocate for more public discussions and participation in land use decisions. I think the methodology in this section doesn't do that. Why would we not want to do that? I've heard about wanting to have tag teaming. Willing to work, inclusivity, things like that, yet the wording of this bill in this section does not adhere to those words. There's a disconnect in what's being said and what's being written. And what's being written, if we were to come up for a vote before midnight, and if it were to pass, that type of disconnect, we're going to have to go with the words, not some of the rhetoric that's been stated about the words. And that's why I ask questions about definitions and the words being used. Because again, those words matter, and it's going to get into how things get looked into and implemented in whatever work product comes out of it. When we hear from some of the academics, some people have been advocating for this, nothing against them personally, but when we start hearing that there's too much participation in land use, or that planning and zoning commissioners or people making land use decisions in the town may not, quote unquote, be educated enough, I don't know where that comes from. I really don't. I can tell you that on my planning and zoning commission, I probably have the most advanced education, just by sheer years of my education, than anybody else on the commission. I had to go through 4 years of college. I had to do 4 years of medical school, 3 years of internal medicine residency training, 3 years of becoming a specialist or a fellowship in hematology and medical oncology. All of those years, does that make me more educated or smarter than anybody else making the land use decisions in my town? Absolutely not. In fact, I have people who only graduated high school, working on farms, have some of the most common sense and come up with some of the most creative ideas during my time serving on a planning and zoning commission, and that's phenomenal. And I didn't come up with some of that stuff. And even though I've had far more years of education and training. In fact, one member served, I think, 25 plus years, was a founding member of my town's zoning commission, understood the history of the town, and has some of the most common sense statements, some of the most common sense input, and some of the people in my community, likewise. Again, folks coming out to participate in this section of this bill, when you start looking at some of the people advocating for it and writing articles saying this over participation, that just tells you what they think of the people who live in the towns, that they know better, and that is wrong. We should not support that, especially as people elected to represent the people of Connecticut. And all of us here in this circle represent the entirety of the population of our wonderful state. We should fight against some of this stuff that says that people don't have expertise and enough education. They absolutely do, because it's their town, and this methodology doesn't recognize that whatsoever. And that isn't good at all, and I don't think we should be supporting that type of stuff. I do want to say that there's been some other academic stuff that's come out, including by people who advocate for this, who are trying to say that this methodology is absolutely needed, and this gets into my discussion of this section of the bill, because, again, what is happening isn't working because zoning is creating segregation, it is being discriminatory. Absolutely not true. Again, we have laws against that, and good laws in place for decades that this state has used, and the feds have used their own laws, and rightly so when the facts justify. However, one of the things we have to be mindful of is this notion that towns are somehow creating zoning and championing single-family housing, not so much multifamily, and therefore that is unfair to people for housing affordability. That's not true. In fact, I can tell you one of the reasons we don't want, especially in this methodology of this section of the bill, to say that all housing should be as of right and not go through any review process is because there are good things that need to be reviewed. For example, when we're talking about building things, especially if you're going to rely upon septic systems, wells, what is the surrounding area? We want to make certain we're protecting the environment. Haven't we heard that this session? About wanting to do things to be helpful for the environment? That's important. We have open spaces that we protect. Don't we want to do that? I've heard some people say that just because there's open space when I drive through a town, ooh, there's an opportunity to build, affordable housing, and the town's not using that open space. Well, maybe they're not using the open space because a lot of the open space might be taken up by farms, might be actually protected wildlife areas, might be an aquifer protection area, might be good for recreation, or just because you just don't want to cut down all the trees and all the wildscape and you want to have good wildlife habitats in some of our towns. I won't get into wildlife meaning bears because that's a different issue, but nevertheless, there are things that we need to be mindful of when we're doing these reviews. And these reviews are not done to prevent affordable housing. It's done to make certain that what is being proposed is meeting fire safety codes, building codes, public health codes, matching what could work in that section of a town, so not to create problems that could be avoided, including others in the area, other towns. So there's a lot that goes into what towns can and cannot do. I can tell you, as I've mentioned earlier, having talked with a lot of developers who might have been interested in affordable housing in my town, they never saw the zoning regulations as standing in the way. What they saw standing in the way was, we just don't have the public infrastructure. We don't have the road system, the public transportation, the jobs. They're not going to build for what the market is not going to bear. They're smart. They know they're not going to do that. So why would we then try to set up this group to come up with a methodology to try to then, which unfortunately could lead to a mandate for something that just doesn't work? Again, we should be letting the towns do what they're doing. They're doing a good job. Not get into this methodology of this section and not necessarily do a top-down, all-size-fits-all approach, and then scratch our heads later to wonder why things didn't go right. We should be taking that time now to make certain we can do it right. And again, I think because the process has been rushed the way this has come out to us and what's being put in is not right, and we should make certain we can do a better process and partner with people better and see what we can do moving forward in that regard. One of the things that, in addition, why we want to make certain we're having appropriate reviews, especially multifamily, I've done those reviews as a commissioner, a planning and zoning commissioner, is in addition we want to make certain that if these things are built and people move in, hey, I'm fine with some of the multifamily that has been in my town. Good people live in them. That's great. Happy to have them. Have no problem at all if someone would like to move into the community. Is that they're moving in knowing that what's been created is good. Because if we don't do certain reviews, do we want to then rush a review and not do proper public health, not do proper building code review, not do proper fire safety code? This methodology that's likely going to come out and what's, I think, baked in to the this section of the bill that may lead to some later discussion by the legislature about mandates, just to say you have to do a certain amount of affordable housing and zoning is bad, and thus we have to tell the towns that they need to not do some of their local processes. That could actually create problems for people who would move into those affordable housing units. That would be unfair to them. And this is why we do appropriate reviews. I can tell you, when I do any review as a commissioner, but also when I have to run the meeting as chair, I'm not there saying I'm there to deny it. I'm there to see, does it meet the regulations and other state regulations that have to be put into play, and what could be done working with people to perhaps make it better? And that's a great process, but this methodology and the way that it is very broadly written and doesn't really appropriately, I think, set up a good process, doesn't take that into account. Or if it took it into account, it is ignoring it. And if that's the case, that's actually not good at all. And I think we should really be getting back to a cogent, clear, and common sense process. And again, I would not argue in favor of the wording that's in that section. That gets me to another quick point before actually I'm going to call an amendment, is I am not outright opposed to everything raised in Section 516 of this bill. In fact, I did highlight this. There are some good things. And I think that some of what's being talked about, the methodology, which I do have concerns about the way it's written and the way it might be intended, but especially the way it's written, I think we could make better. And if that were to be the case, then I could support that. But I don't see that. And that is a concern. And I think that, again, is a missed opportunity. So if I may, well, I guess not going to call you Madam President, but Mr. President. Mr. President, the clerk is in possession of LCO number, if I got this correctly, 9847. I ask the clerk to please call the amendment.
Mr. Clerk, if you would call LCO 9847.
LCO number 9847, Senate Amendment D.
Thank you, Mr. Clerk. Senator, you may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move adoption of the amendment, waive reading, and seek leave to summarize.
Senator Gordon, you've been granted leave of the chamber. You may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. President. Again, I'll try to make certain I can keep my remarks on this amendment, being mindful we have to be done by midnight. With that said, I think I've gone through, I think, very well why this amendment striking Section 516 in its entirety and renumbering the remaining sections and internal references accordingly. This is a two-sentence amendment. It's a straightforward amendment, but it's actually a very important amendment. And I'm just going to summarize quickly. I don't know how long I've been talking, but I've been happy to discuss this issue. That if we have very loose wording as far as how this is going to be set up to try to create methodology, if we're going to be trying to put all of this authority to making some of these decisions about who's going to be working on this methodology to one person, whoever that may be at that time, and if we're going to then see about some of this methodology that I think is already predetermined, and we're going to come up with something that basically is going to be what's already been presented previously but was taken out of a different bill relative to fair share, we are not doing the people of Connecticut justice, and we're not being cognizant of and respecting, and I'll say this one more time, that the people of Connecticut know best what is best for their towns. For all of those reasons, I would hope that my colleagues would recognize the flaws in the process, the flaws in some of the section 516 of the bill. I'm mindful that likely this may go by a party line vote, which I think would be a shame and not doing good service for public policy, but I'm realistic and I understand things. I think for all of these reasons, and also really wanting to make certain that we could really try to achieve the goal we all want to achieve of housing affordability for people, I would ask that this, I urge adoption of the amendment, and I would ask that when a vote is taken, Mr. President, it's by a roll call vote.
Thank you, Senator Gordon. Would you care to comment? Would you care to comment on the amendment? Would you care to comment on the amendment? If not, the machine will be open. Madam Clerk, would you announce the pendency of a roll call vote?
An immediate roll call vote has been ordered in the Senate. An immediate roll call vote has been ordered in the Senate. Voting on Amendment D, LCO 9847. An immediate roll call vote in the Senate.
Oh, the machine will be locked. The clerk will announce the tally.
Senate Amendment D, Senate Bill 998, total number voting 36, total voting 812, total voting 824, absent not voting 0.
Thank you, Mr. Clerk. The amendment fails. Senator Gordon.
Mr. President, I'm not surprised it did. I am disappointed. I won't say heartbroken, but I think this having gone the way it has, I think actually supports what I've been saying about the process and a preordained process, outcome. So I think actually, even though I'm disappointed in the outcome of what happened on the vote for the amendment, I don't think, I think in some way it shines some light, and that's fine if we do that. And I think we'll just continue to shine, some light on things. I want to move to a different section of the bill. This, if I'm correct, is section 529. And there's a part of it here that talks about fees or not collecting fees for a building permit relative to workforce housing opportunity development projects. And if I have it correctly here, and again, I apologize if the copy I have isn't the right line numbers, but I believe it's lines 1629 to 1634. It talks about notwithstanding any municipal charter, home rule ordinance, or special act, no municipality, and I'm going to emphasize it, no municipality shall collect any fee for a building permit application for the construction or substantial rehabilitation of an eligible workforce housing opportunity development project as defined in section 526 of this act, or two, a workforce housing development project as defined in section 8-395 as amended by this act. I have a concern about that. I have no concern about trying to support and promote workforce housing opportunities. In fact, I think there's been some good efforts that this legislature, legislative session, to see what we can do in general about workforce development. I think that's good. And in fact, workforce housing opportunity is part of workforce development. If we're going to want to recruit people to come in to work in Connecticut, if we want to keep them here in Connecticut, then yes, housing is important. Workforce housing is important. In fact, I've done reviews of that in my town to see where we stand. It happens to be more about farming and agricultural venues, but I think that's important. And I think we can all agree that we have a shared goal of doing what we can do reasonably and responsibly, but also realistically, to further things in the state about workforce housing opportunities and workforce housing development projects. And that's a shared goal. We may have differences of opinion relative to how we get there, or really what it is, ultimately we would like to see as the outcome. But I think we all share the goal, and I would argue to anyone who says that any one of us in this circle or legislature or in this legislature doesn't support that goal, I would argue that they're wrong, because I think we all share that goal, and I'm proud to join my colleagues in sharing that goal. However, I think this is unfair to towns and cities. If we're going to say they're going to shall not collect any fee for a building permit, they're still going to have their building official do a review. I don't know how many people in this Senate and House have actually spent time with building officials working with them. I have. Gets back to what I do as a town official, as chair of my town's Planning and Zoning Commission. That we know that when things are built, we want building official review. We don't want things built not up to code. That's certainly unsafe. That we would not want whatsoever. If someone's going to move into a house, into a condo, into multifamily housing, into workforce housing or developments, we want to make certain it does meet proper building codes because we want them and their families to be as safe as can be. And that's why we actually do have building codes. I didn't bring the state building code manual with me, but it's big. I don't profess to know it all. I do know some key parts of it. So to have a town have to have their building official go through this review. And it's not like you just take a look at a plan and, oh, you're set. This actually, you have to go out and take a look at things. You're working with contractors, subcontractors, the developer. There's a lot that goes into what a building official actually has to do. It's not something simple. They do have certification. The building officials I've worked with over the years do a great job, do a thorough job, and they really take the time. But it does cost money. And towns do have land use fee ordinances. I know it because many years ago, I updated my land use fee ordinance, and we did it to make certain that it properly captured the work that towns do, but not overcharge. And I'm glad that in all the reviews over the years that we've done in my town of that land use fee ordinance update, we've never shown that we've overcharged, that we've matched the cost of the work done, and we got buy-in from contractors and subcontractors and developers. But to tell a town that they shall not charge the fee for work that they have to do, and that they should be doing, and that they must be doing, and if they don't do, they are liable, is wrong. And so with that said, let me just make certain I have the paper that I am looking for here. Somewhere I do. I just got to quickly find it, Mr. President. I don't know what I know I have one of them here. I don't think I have the right copy. But I think I do have the right copy of what I'm trying to call up. But I believe that the clerk is in possession of Amendment LCO number 9862, and I asked the clerk to bring it up.
Madam Clerk, would you call LCO 9862?
Yes, I just verified that is the correct one, Mr. President.
Senate Amendment E, LCO 9862.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. Senator Gordon, you may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move adoption of the amendment, waive the reading, and seek leave to summarize.
Leave has been granted. You may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. President. I will summarize and endeavor to get right to the point since we've called up this amendment. As I've already mentioned, we want to make certain we're adhering to building codes. This amendment makes a very simple change. It just says we're going to strike out the wording, and instead of basically saying that towns shall not charge the fee, they may waive the fee. Let them decide. If they feel that there needs to be a big review that's going to take a huge amount of staff time, well, why should other people who pay taxes in that town to pay for the building department have to then subsidize somebody else's project? If it's not a big project, maybe a town might say as a way to incentivize these types of projects, we will waive the fee. That's fine. But let the towns decide that. Why should the state think it knows better than the towns and cities, all 169, again, that all of us collectively represent? Let the towns decide. And again, if they want to go ahead and say, we will waive it, I don't have a problem with that. In fact, sometimes that's a way to incentivize things. But if they have to charge because of the real breadth and scope of what's done, we should give them that opportunity and not make it basically an unfunded mandate. That would be unfair. I think common sense would dictate what this amendment says, which is a municipality may waive the collection of any fee. I would hope that my colleagues would agree with me. That's common sense. Why wouldn't we want to support that? And let the towns decide and figure out how they want to handle it. sometimes on a case-by-case basis, depending upon what might be. I would argue to anyone who votes no on this amendment to tell me why we wouldn't want to give the towns that flexibility, why we would want to put an unfunded mandate on towns and cities. But I won't belabor that point. What I do would want to wrap up and say, well, one thing before I wrap up and urge adoption is, when we're thinking of ways to try to promote, no matter what it may be, workforce, housing developments, things like that, we want to go back to the towns and cities, see what they're doing, understand their processes. That's where I mentioned previously about wanting to make certain that one can hoof it out to those towns and cities to know exactly what they're doing, why they're doing it, how they're doing it, when they do it, all that good stuff, what they do. And then, once you understand what they're doing, unless they're blatantly doing something illegal or something that's really bad, then we should be facilitating the work they do. We should have a fostering atmosphere to work with them. This is a very flexible, common sense option. And I think you'll find, and I've seen this from personal experience as a town official, that there are times if we say, do you know what, if you bring in certain types of development projects and you meet certain criteria that we know can work in our town or city, in this case for workforce development opportunities, and if you can meet those marks, or if in fact you go beyond it and do more than you're required, if that's what you want to do to help people, we will incentivize you. We'll give you something extra. We can waive the fees. That actually sometimes brings about very good outcomes. I've seen that in a number of things for trying to help set aside open space, where we say, hey, you have to do a certain amount of open space, but if you go beyond that of your own choosing, we're actually going to give you incentives to certain degrees. And some developers actually will do that. And that's a great way to work and partner. And I think this can create that. And I can tell you that for some developers who I've worked with over the years, that if they decide that they want to go beyond what the requirement is, because we're going to incentivize it, they clearly go beyond. And so those are the type of developers we would want to welcome into communities to see what we can do working with them. And in fact, the end result is you can help more people, especially for workforce development projects. So again, to me, this gets back to what I've said previously, common sense, letting the towns do what they do. And again, as I think people have probably already heard many times tonight, is the people of Connecticut know best what is best for their towns. This amendment gets to that. I urge adoption of the amendment. And Mr. President, when there's a vote, I ask for a roll call vote, please.
Absolutely. Thank you, Senator Gordon. The amendment. Would you care to remark on the amendment? If not, the machine will be open. Amendment fails. Thank you, Mr. Clerk. Senator Gordon.
Mr. President, I'm not surprised by the outcome of the vote. I will say I'm disappointed, but realistic. I think this is another missed opportunity along the line of some other missed opportunities. I think these have been, was an amendment that was common sense and that really was meant to be fostering inclusivity and working with people and partnering more with our municipalities all throughout the state. I'm hopeful that we can try to see what we can do to bring up more common sense ideas and more fostering of a good multilateral working relationship, and hopefully we can see what we can do moving forward. But Mr. President, at this point I'm going to end my remarks, and I look forward to hearing what other of my colleagues here in the circle have to say tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Gordon. Would you care to remark further? Would you care to remark further?